Welcome back. It was just our little introductory discussion because in honor of the Romanian Archangel Day this week, that's why we talked about the archangels. But now I'd like to go to our discussions again of the oral tradition, Torah verbal tradition of Judaism. And we were on this page over here. There. And last time I talked about the Mishnah. I said the Mishnah was the first attempt to write down this oral tradition. And remember, the tradition, as I said, logically must have existed prior to this, even prior to the Second Temple, because from day one, people had to know how to keep the commandments, how to keep the Sabbath, how to keep the Passover, how to bind the thing on your head and on your arms, all the various things that had to be known. And if there's no tradition of how it's to be kept, how is it possibly kept? So a lot of these things had to be known from day one. And that was our discussion last time. This time, I just want to talk about the books. So the first one is called the Mishnah. And I said the Mishnah, which is written in Hebrew, it's written in the Galilee. The reason why it's written in the Galilee is by the year 200, Jews were not allowed in Jerusalem. The name of Jerusalem was changed by the Romans to Aelia Capitolina. It was a pagan city, and Jews were not allowed in. The only exception was during the 3.5 years during the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Roman government from 132 until 135, where successfully Simon Bar Kokhba, or Simon ben Kuziba, which was his original name, they changed it to Bar Kokhba, meaning the son of the star, right? The étoile. And for 3.5 years, they were able to free Jerusalem. But then, of course, the Romans came with larger forces and basically threw them out of the city. They retreated to Beitar, and the Romans followed them to Beitar, destroyed the city, and left the corpses in the fields for months and months until they were allowed to be buried. So that was from 132 to 135 of the Common Era. And after that event, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was the president of the Sanhedrin, high court, which originally was in Jerusalem, but at this point was in the Galilee, came to the conclusion that there is no other possibility but to write down everything we know from the oral tradition, or else it will be forgotten. So what he does, the first attempt to write down a corpus, is this book called the Mishnah. And as I said last time, the Mishnah has 6 categories within it: the agricultural laws, festival laws, laws of courts, the family laws, temple laws, and the laws of purity and priests. And each one of these categories is called an order of the Mishnah. Each one has about 10 books, which are called tractata. And so there are about 60 books in the Mishnah. This is the first attempt to write down this tradition. But as I said, also last time, Yehuda Hanassi, number one, he writes it down in a very concise fashion. It's very short because he doesn't want to write down too much. Because of this, the sayings of the Mishnah are quite short. Every Mishnah is about 4 to 5 lines. And it's extremely concise. For instance, in the order of Nizikin, of damages, of courts, there's a Mishnah that says, if 2 people are holding a garment, say a coat, and this one says it's my coat, and the other one says it's my coat. So the Mishnah says, you divide it. What does it mean you divide it? You sell the coat and divide the money. The only problem is that doesn't make sense. Let's say 2 people walked into my house. Now, right behind me, there's a coat closet. So they walk in, they see the coat closet, they grab a coat. First one says, "It's my coat." The other one says, "It's my coat." I say, "Excuse me, this is my house, it's my coat." So really the question is, did you see the coat in a private domain or in a public domain? Obviously, if you found the coat in a private area that belongs to somebody, it's that person's coat, nobody else's. But even if you found the coat in a park, in a public domain, let's say you found a coat in Chishmiju Park, sitting on a bench, and you pick it up, you can't say it's your coat. Let's say you look in the lapel of the coat right here, and it says Joey Greenberg, and then there's a phone number. So, it probably belongs to Joey Greenberg because it says right there. So if there is a siman, if there's a sign, then even in a public place, you can't say that it belongs to the person who picked it up. Now, let's say you found a coat, but it's only been there for 5 minutes. Maybe somebody was sitting there, they walked away, it was warm out, they forgot they left their coat, they look at their watch, they say, "Uh-oh, I left my coat." They run back, and they show up a half an hour later. You have to give people a chance, right? You can't just walk off with the coat, unless, of course, you work in the radio and you think that you'll be able to get to hundreds of thousands of people. But in general, you have to, let's say you found, 5 books stacked one on top of the other. It actually could belong to somebody. It could also be that they just wanted to give it away. That's possible. So I'm just saying that there also has to be what we call Yeush Baalim, that the proprietor gave up hope of coming back and picking it up again. For instance, if you're walking on the sidewalk in Romania and you see a bill for 100 RON. If it doesn't say anything on the bill, and most bills doesn't say anything except for names of people in the government, so there's no siman, it's in a public area. In that case, unless you saw somebody walking in front of you who fell out of their pocket, yes, you can pick it up because there is absolutely no way to identify the owner. Unless they actually wrote their name, which I think is against the law, but some people do it anyhow. So, yeah. But again, if it's in a public area, and if there is some type of sign, or if it's even, the sign could even be not writing. Let's say somebody has a coat, and the coat, has a hole in the left sleeve, a small hole. So the owner probably knows that. So if somebody calls you up and said, "Did you find such and such coat in such a nice day?" And you can say, "Okay, give me another sign." Okay, the sign has a little hole on the left sleeve. It's yours. So, so these things are also discussed. The idea of the sign, the idea of the public area, private area. So then how can the Mishnah just say that if 2 people found a coat, that they divided? It depends on the circumstance. Okay, so the Mishnah is very concise, and it assumes that you know the discussion. It doesn't go to the discussion because it assumes that you're aware of the discussion surrounding the circumstances. So before I continue, let me just write down the names before I forget. So what was I saying? So as I said, the Mishnah is very concise. And because of that, in the 200 years following the Mishnah, between 200 and 500 of the Common Era, as the Jewish communities are moving to Babylonia, Bavel, today the area of Iraq, more or less, maybe parts of Turkey, but mostly Iraq. In the study academies of Babylonia, they discuss these Mishnah, the Mishnayot, we say in the plural. And the discussions are basically not commentaries, but they are an attempt to understand what happens in every circumstance. So instead of a commentary, it's actually a discussion. This discussion we refer to as Gemara. As you see here, the term Gemara over here is basically the discussions around the Mishnah. What was the Mishnah talking about? What happens in this case? What happens in that case? So it's not a commentary, it's an expansion of the Mishnah. Now the Gemara, which is written from the year 200 to 500, the names of the people in the Gemara, the ones in the Mishnah, we call them Tanaim, which in Aramaic means teachers. Then in the Gemara, the name of these scholars are called Amoraim, which possibly comes from the Hebrew to talk, Amar. This is written in Babylonia, and it's written in Aramaic. The reason why it's written in Aramaic is because that was the vernacular of Babylonia. Everybody spoke Aramaic. It was the lingua franca of the country. So even though today it might be like in Israel, obviously Hebrew is easier to understand than Aramaic. So a lot of Israelis think that the Gemara was written in Aramaic to make it difficult. But no, it was to make it easier. Because in Babylonia, people spoke Aramaic and they did not speak Hebrew. Even the Jews didn't speak Hebrew as much as Aramaic. So the Gemara is a commentary, more than a commentary, it's an expansion of the Mishnah. You can have 6 lines of Mishnah and 10 folio pages, meaning 2 sides of Gemara. I mean, we're talking about we're talking about something which is 30 times longer than the Mishnah, maybe sometimes 100 times longer, depending on how long the discussion takes. So these 2 books together, the Mishnah, which was edited by Yehuda Nasi, and the Gemara, which was finished around the year 500, written in Babylonia, these 2 books together are referred to as the Talmud. Talmud includes the Mishnah and the Gemara. 85% of the Talmud is the Gemara because that's the discussion in Aramaic. About 15% is the Mishnah because the Mishnah is just much shorter than the Gemara. The Mishnah is in Hebrew, the Gemara is in Aramaic. And the literature which comes out during this time from about minus 100 till plus 500 is referred to as rabbinic literature. In Hebrew, Chazal literature. Chazal is an acronym which means Chachamenu Zichronam Livracha, our sages of blessed memory. So it's called the sages literature, or I think the university would just refer to it as rabbinic literature. But it's classic rabbinic literature, meaning from the classic period of Judaism. Just like in the West, classic period is a period of Greece and Rome. The classic period of rabbinic literature is the Talmudic period. And all of the literature which was composed by these scholars of the Tanaim and the Amoraim are considered classical Judaism. So if we're talking about sacred and interpretive text, these interpretive texts are considered sacred text outside of the written Torah because they're considered the authentic Jewish interpretation of the text. In a very expanded discussion, there are about 40 volumes of the Talmud, and it's not even on every book of the Mishnah. Can anybody guess which books of the Mishnah might have been left out by the Gemara? Can you try to guess? Which books of the Mishnah might have been left out by the Gemara, which was written in Babylonia? Let's see if anybody can guess. These are the categories. See if anybody can guess. Who's going to win the prize?
Temple.
What? One second. I'm in a class. I'll call you in about an hour. You know what, Margola? I will call you in about an hour. I'm in a class. You'll be fine. Yeah. Okay. Since I don't know if anybody can guess, but I'll tell you which one's not. Look at this list. The first one is Zera'im. Zera'im, aside from the lesson of the book on blessings, the other books have to do with the agricultural laws of the land of Israel, like the sabbatical year, which we're in right now, like the laws of the first fruit, and the tithes, which are given to the Levites, and the truma, which is given to the priests. All those books are left out by the Babylonian Talmud because they were living in Babylonia. So it was more critical to discuss other things because the agricultural laws of the land of Israel apply when you're living in the land of Israel. Moed, the festivals, there's complete Gemara on every one of all the 10 books of Moed. Damages and courts, of course. Family laws, yes. So these three entirely expanded by the Babylonian Talmud. Laws of the temple, laws of priests and purity. Some of them yes, some of them no. The ones that are pertinent for life in Babylonia, there is an expansion by the Gemara, the Babylonian Gemara, Babylonian Talmud, but others not, like the laws of the offerings. It's true that the Talmud does sometimes discuss, by the way, when I say Talmud, I mean the Mishnah and the Gemara together, mostly the Gemara, which is 85%. So sometimes the Talmud will discuss laws of offerings when it's talking about a holiday. Which offering do you bring on the Sabbath? Which offering do you bring on Passover, on Tabernacles, Sukkot? So it will talk about it indirectly, but it did not put together an actual book of an expansion on those offerings. That's why it's actually good that we have two versions of the Gemara. We have what's called the Babylonian Talmud, which is the Gemara that was written in Babylonia. Simultaneously, we had Gemara that was written in Judea. That's referred to as the Jerusalem Talmud. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud because it was written in Galilee. Oh, there were no Jews in Jerusalem at the time. In honor of Jerusalem, they called it the Jerusalem Talmud. And sometimes it's referred to as the Palestinian Talmud because the Babylonian Talmud calls it the Talmud of the land of Israel. In Ramallah, they got excited when they heard there was a Palestinian Talmud until they started reading it. But anyhow, so their Gemara that was written in the land of Israel simultaneously did not have the same editing as a Gemara that was written in Babylonia. And for that reason, it's not studied as much. The language is very difficult. It's also written in Aramaic, but the language is extremely concise and difficult. It seems to leave out words. So it's very, very hard to understand. Aside from that, most of the volumes are missing. But the lucky thing is that there are volumes in the Jerusalem Talmud on tractates of the Mishnah, which the Babylonian Talmud left out. For instance, the Jerusalem Talmud has the entire Mishnah on the agricultural laws, which are left out from the Babylonian Talmud. So that's helpful. For instance, some of them overlap, of course, but okay. Questions? So basically, when we say there's a Jerusalem Talmud, a Babylonian Talmud, it's two versions of the Gemara, but the Babylonian Talmud is the one which is studied mostly. And it was understood even its time that it was a monumental work. It was probably the largest work on law anywhere in those days. You had 40 volumes on law. So that I don't think there's a precedent for that in antiquity. And this is finished by the 5th century. Between 500 and 600, we have another group of scholars in Babylonia called Sivoraim, which means the ones who, Svara actually means to have an intellectual opinion. The Sivoraim de facto were the editors of the Talmud, of the Babylonian Talmud. They took the Babylonian version of the Talmud and they improved it. How do you improve it? By smoothing out the discussions, making them much more understandable, adding words of explanation if necessary, making the arguments much more logical. And they worked on this for 100 years. We even have names of Sivoraim within the Babylonian Talmud, which actually shows that every now and then they did put the names of the people who were editing in, but only some of them. And they added and did a lot of real editing to the Babylonian Talmud. So today, the Babylonian Talmud, aside from the Aramaic, which makes it a little bit difficult, but once you get through the Aramaic, the discussions are very logical. They say if you're good at understanding the Babylonian Talmud, you'll also be good at chess. Shach. It's a very logical game. So that's what they say. Anyhow, there are two parts to Talmudic discussions. One part are the legal parts, where they discuss the Mishnah and they try to understand what happens in every scenario and who does the law follow? Because as I said, sometimes in the Mishnah, there are 3 or 4 opinions. Rarely does the Mishnah give only one opinion. So in the discussions of the Gemara, they try sometimes to understand which is the dominant opinion, but sometimes not. It's almost like the Gemara is happy with the discussion. They don't have to come to a conclusion. Sometimes discussions are much more interesting than the conclusions. It's like the story about this fellow is sitting in the study hall in the yeshiva, and he's studying a page of the Talmud. And somebody looks at him looking at the page, comes back a week later, he sees the same guy in the study hall looking at the same page in the Talmud. He says, "You were on that page last week." He says, "I like this page." So, I mean, you have a discussion, and sometimes they're interesting discussions. So you can think about it. What does this mean? Very often, if you've seen a yeshiva, which is a traditional study hall, it's done in the partner system with buddies. You study with 2 people, and the idea is that you're supposed to criticize. One person gives an explanation, you say, well, it could be like this. And so one says it could be like that. Because the Talmud does the same thing. The Talmud starts with a preposition, which is the Mishnah. It'll bring another source, which might challenge the Mishnah, and then it'll discuss which source is more correct and bring different discussions. What would happen in this case? What would happen in this case? Sometimes people make a joke of that, but that's exactly how it works. And the truth is that's exactly how it works in a court of law. So it's really not unusual. When you understand that the Talmud is not a legal codex, it's a discussion. It's a book of legal theory. The legal codexes of Judaism are developed hundreds of years later after the Talmud. But the Talmud itself is a book which is a very lively discussion. That's why it's so much more interesting than the legal codes, because it's not just telling you what to do. It's trying to figure out what we're supposed to do from the sources. And you have lots of opinions fighting with each other. So it's very easy to take a side and just jump in and continue the discussion, which was what most of the commentaries on the Talmud do. They look for flaws in the arguments, and they try to look for meanings behind the arguments, legal, or try to create even ways of understanding the arguments. And so, as I said, the Talmud is very lively discussion, and that's usually what's studied in traditional yeshivot, academies of study. That's why you can see them arguing all the time. So I'll tell you a story, which is a joke, but every joke is based on a little grain of truth. So the joke is, this man comes to the rabbi, says, "Rabbi, I've never had the opportunity to study Talmud. Could you please teach me?" Rabbi says, "I'm not going to teach you because I don't think you'd understand." And says, "What do you mean I wouldn't understand? How dare you say that? You know what? Ask me a question and we'll see." Rabbi says, "Okay, I'll ask you a question. You get it right, I teach you Talmud. How about that?" Man says, "Okay, fine." Says, "Look, I don't know if I told you the story. 2 burglars go down a chimney. Did I tell you the story? Okay, how do you say burglars in Romanian? 2 thieves. Okay, ganavim we say in Hebrew. Right. So 2 burglars go down a chimney. How do you say a chimney? Where the smoke comes out.
Horn.
Okay. And one of them, he got the soot from the chimney. His face is all black from the soot, from the dirt. He has a dirty face. And the other one has a clean face. So the rabbi says to the man, "Who is going to wash their face?" Man says, "That's obvious. The one with the dirty face." Rabbi says, "I told you don't understand Talmud." He says, "What do you mean?" Says, "The one with the dirty face sees his friend who has a clean face, so he thinks that his face is also clean. But the one with the clean face sees the one with the dirty face, and he assumes his face is dirty, so he goes to wash his face." So the man says, "Oh, I didn't think of it that way." Says, "I told you, it's not for you." Says, No, give me another chance." Says, "Okay, another chance? I'll give you a second chance. Okay, that's it." And says, "Okay." Says, "Okay, 2 burglars are going through the chimney. One of them has a dirty face, one of them has a clean face, right?" Says, "Yeah." "Who's going to wash their face?" Man says, "We just said the one with the clean face." And he says, "No, you're wrong." Says, "What do you mean I'm wrong?" Says, "Well, once the one with the clean face goes to wash his face, the one with the dirty face realizes that maybe his face is dirty, and that's why the other guy is washing his face. So both of them are going to wash their face." Says, "Oh, I see." Says, "Okay, so forget it. It's not for you." Says, "No, give me one more chance. Okay, one more chance." So he says, "Okay, 2 burglars are going through a chimney. One of them has a clean face, one of them has a dirty face." Okay. Rabbi says, "So what's the question?" And says, "What do you mean, what's the question?" I said, "What is the question?" He said, "Well, the question is, who's going to wash their face, right?" He says, "That's not a question, that we already know." He says, "What do you mean?" "The question is, how come 2 burglars go down the same chimney and only one of them has a dirty face?" And that's the question. Okay, that's a joke. But the point is that in Talmudic discussions, they really, they try to cover every angle, and that's why that joke was created. I'll tell you one other joke about Talmudic thinking. This I saw in a book somewhere. This guy's, I forget the name of the book. Some guy writes Jewish jokes from Eastern Europe. Okay, so the joke goes, Rabbi Sharfman gets onto a tranul in Budapest, and he's going to his little town near Bistrica, so coming home to Transylvania. So he's sitting on the train. In those days, it took a very long time, the beginning of the 20th century. So they're going on the train. And where he's on the train, he sees a man dressed up in a really fancy suit and a nice hat and a beautiful pipe. And he's thinking, who is this guy with a fancy suit? And as they're going, they cross the border, and you have large towns there. What's the first one? I don't know. Cluj, maybe? Doesn't get off at Cluj. So it looks like he's going to a small town. And in fact, it looks like he might be going to the same town as Rabbi Sharfman, which is a very small town. He's thinking, why would this person, a professional, who obviously has a good job, came from a big town, why would he come to a little village like where I live? Let me think. He says, I'm going to use the Talmudic deduction to try to figure this out. Says, okay, let's figure this out. If he has such a fancy suit and he's coming to our town, maybe he's a professional. Let's see. Maybe he is a lawyer, an advocate. But wait a sec, who would pay so much money for an advocate from Budapest to come to our little town? And besides, when people have fights, I arbitrate and I help them out. They don't have to pay so much money for a fancy lawyer all the way from Budapest. Well, doesn't make sense. Let's think what else. Maybe he's a doctor. Again, I mean, we have a woman. She's a midwife. If somebody gives birth, okay, Sarah Leah's filling out. So could be she has to give birth. But again, why pay so much money, a fancy doctor from Budapest, when we have a midwife right in the town who helps out with such things? Unnecessary. Doesn't make sense. So what else could it be? Why would this man be coming? Wait a second. Maybe, what else? Is anybody else? Oh, wait a sec, wait. There's Moshe. Moshe, yeah, has a bit of a dental problem. But why pay so much money for a dentist from Budapest? You can go somewhere near. You have just near us. They have other places you can go to. Maybe in Dej. No. So he says that, wait a second. But Moshe had a younger brother. What was his younger brother? Yosef. And Yosef was supposed to, he went to Budapest to study in the university. That's right. Yosef Cohen, went to study in the university, and maybe he went to study dentistry. So wait a sec, maybe this is a doctor, and he's a dentist, and then he's Moshe Cohen's younger brother. That would make sense. He came to help him out. But wait a second. If he went to Budapest, which dentist in Budapest is going to call themselves Joseph Cohen? Nobody's going to come. He must have changed his name. What would it have been? So from Joseph, it could have been Janusz, maybe Janusz. And instead of Cohen would be, what would that be? Help me out. With what do they say? I forget already. What's that Hungarian name?
Kozak. I don't
know. No. I keep forgetting.
Horvat is an.
What? Kovac. Yeah. So he says, yeah. So it wouldn't be Cohen, it'd be Kovac. So maybe his name is Janusz Kovac. Okay. So he puts down his newspaper. He turns to the man. He says, "Excuse me, I want to introduce myself. I am Rabbi Sharfstein. You must be, of course, Dr. Janusz Kovac." The man looks at him and says, "How did you know my name?" He says, "It was obvious." Yeah. Okay. So let's get back to this. So what exactly is, let's get back to this for a moment. Yeah. So, I don't know, everybody's calling me today. I just want to see who called me. Okay. Sorry. So the Chazal literature, the Talmudic literature, the rabbinic literature is classic Judaism. The most important works in the Chazal literature are the Talmud. Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud specifically, is more widely read, and it consists of Mishnah and the Gemara, which we just had before. Aside from the Mishnah, there are two other collections of Tanaic legal material. These two other collections, I think I have them here at the bottom of the page. No, I don't, so I'll put them right here. These two other collections are called, if I can fit it in somewhere, Baraita and Tosefta. You see, when Yehuda Nasi put together his Mishnah, he did not put in all the sayings of the Tanaim. He decided to leave out the ones which we assume he didn't think was important to the practice. Meaning, in a sense, he tried to select those which he thought were closer to what should be the proper practice. But not everybody agreed with him. And the ones that were left out were collected. The first corpus is called Braita, and the second one, which means which was left outside, from the Aramaic word bar, which means outside. You know, it's cold outside, you go brr, so it's like bar, outside, Braita. And the second one is the Tosefta, which means an appendix, something which was left outside, in addition. The Gemara, when it discusses the Mishnah, it always quotes the Braita and the Tosefta. And always says, why did the Mishnah say this when the Braita said that? Why does the Mishnah say this when the Tosefta says that? And it tries to understand what is the correct version of the text. So this is part of the discussions on the Mishnah, where it does not leave out anything. I mean, the Gemara does not leave out anything. Another thing, though, in the Gemara, aside from legal discussions, there are a lot of interpretations of text, biblical text. And there are also stories which are brought with teachings in the stories. I'll give one example a little bit later. So I would say possibly 10% of the Gemara are these commentaries and teachings which are not relevant to Jewish law, but were brought within the material. Sometimes if there's a name of somebody who's giving a law, sometimes they'll bring an additional idea that that person said relating to another instance. Could be a story, and it could be a commentary on a biblical verse. So that happens too in the Gemara. We refer to that as Agadah. The parts of the Gemara which are non-legal text are referred to as Agadah. They're not about practice. They're not about the halakha, right? Jewish law is referred to as halakha. So they're not discussions on halakha, called Agadah. Agadah probably comes from the Hebrew word lahagid, which means to talk. So, in modern Hebrew, Agadah means a legend. And there is a book that was in Romanian, which is a collection of the legends of the Talmud. If I can find it, I have it here somewhere. Let's see. No. Oh, here it is. This was put out by Hasefer, called Legends of the Talmud. I think it's either 2 or 3 volumes by Louis Ginsberg. And it's a collection of much of the non-legal discussions of the Talmud. This book, put out by Hasefer. Good thing about their books, they're usually cheap. So, they don't cost a lot. 30 RON, that's about it. So, there's another interesting story about the Talmud. This is a true story. There was at the end of the Second World War, there was in the U.S. Army, there was a rabbi, a chaplain, who was stationed in Japan and remained there after the end of the war. And I keep forgetting his name all the time. I don't know why I keep forgetting his name. What was his name? I'll figure it out one moment. Okay. This is an article about this, but I'm about to tell you, and I think in the article they mentioned the guy's name. A moment. Hold on. Maybe it's not this island. Yes, yes, yes. Right. Okay. So there was an American rabbi in the U.S. Army who was stationed in Japan after the Second World War. His name was Rabbi Marvin Tokayer. That was just his name. And after Japan, he went to live in the United States. He was living in Great Neck, New York. So this Marvin Tokayer was in Japan. He decided, what am I going to do here? So he wrote a book on the legends of the Talmud, and he took like different excerpts from the Talmud. Some of them were legal excerpts, some of them were legends. They put them together in a little book, and he thought that he had it translated into Japanese so that people in Japanese wanted to know a little bit what the Talmud was. So this book had examples from the Talmud. So it came out right after the war, somewhere in the late 40s, and it was published in Japanese. What happened was a Korean fellow came across the book in Japanese, and he was very much impressed by it, and then he had it translated into Korean. And I don't know if you know, in South Korea, people are very involved in their children's education. They feel that the education is going to create their child's future, which of course is true, but it's very, very aggressive competition in the educational world in South Korea, and everybody wants their kids to get ahead. So the Koreans actually think that the Jews are smart. So they want to know why the Jews are smart, and they figured out it must be because of the Talmud, because the Jews study Talmud. So they wanted to know, what's the Talmud? So this guy had the Talmud this book by Marvin Tokayer, which they didn't know was only part of the Talmud. They thought it was the whole Talmud. But this book was translated from Japanese into Korean, and it became a bestseller in South Korea. It's like it was put into the curriculum, the school system. You have to read the book on the Talmud if you want to understand. And it became like a bestseller in South Korea, this book by Marvin Tokayer about the Talmud. So like sometimes you'll meet somebody from South Korea here in Israel, and they'll say, do you know the Talmud? Says, yeah, I read that book. But they mean Marvin Tokayer's book. They don't mean the 40 volumes of the Talmud. It's just interesting how, these things. In the meantime, in Europe, in Poland, in France, they burn the Talmud, but in South Korea, they hold it in high, and they see, they see it as very distinguished. So, which is interesting. Okay, get back to this. So we talked about the sayings of the Tanaim, Mishnah, and the Braita and the Tosefta. We talked about the Gemara, which was written in Babylonia, which we referred to as the Babylonian Talmud. Gemara that was written in Israel at the time, in Judea, the Galilee, is referred to as the Jerusalem Talmud. But as I said, it was not edited by the Sephardim, and therefore it's very, very difficult to understand. Written in a very cryptic, almost esoteric way. Very difficult to understand. One of the good things is that recently there was a very good commentary written in English and Hebrew on the Jerusalem Talmud. And is it? I can show you part of it somewhere. I can find it. Used to be here. Must have moved it. Okay, well, I moved it somewhere. But anyhow, it was done by the Art Scroll Publishing House, and it's very helpful. What you're looking behind me, by the way, this is called the Art Scroll Talmud, which is a Talmud which is translated into English and into Hebrew. And also the first translation of the Talmud into the Hebrew, complete translation, was done by Rabbi Steinsaltz here in Jerusalem who passed away about a year ago. And his translation was the first one which made it highly accessible for everybody. His Hebrew translation. Art Scroll made it more accessible in English. It was a little bit lost in the translation, but it helps.
Sorry, I have a question.
That's okay.
May I?
Yeah.
So we are talking about oral traditions, but in fact we have 40 volumes of Talmud.
Yes.
So is written or is oral? I'm a little bit
Well, that's what I
confused.
explained. Originally, all these ideas were oral, at least let's say the basic ideas of them, what we say, the sayings of the Tanaim were oral. And people knew about the discussions, but if somebody wrote down something, they wrote it just for themselves. They'd never published, they never made it public. Judah Nasi was the first one to write things down in a public fashion, but he doesn't write down his own ideas. It's a collection. It's a collection of sayings of people, of 200 people who lived within a 300-year period. The Gemara also has the names of about 300 Amoraim and discussions which also took place over a 300-year period. So eventually, what remains of the oral tradition was written down. Was there more that wasn't written down? Well, one of the arguments is that the Kabbalah was never written down. That's part of the discussion. We know for sure that there were what we call, there was the secrets of the Torah, or what we would call, let's say, earlier esoteric literature, which existed during the Talmudic period, but we're just not aware of it because it wasn't written down. We're only aware of it because the Talmud talks about it in certain places, but it doesn't actually go into great detail. So it's a little bit hard to know, is the Kabbalah, which is known today, the continuation of this sort of secret literature, or is it something new? It's very hard to answer that question. But there obviously, even if it is whether it's a continuation or something new, there are parallels between some of the old literature that we discovered, like the book of Yetzirah, which is probably written around the 1st century, the book of creation, or even the Hechalot literature, which is from the 2nd to the 7th century. So as I said, what's left over of the oral tradition is what's written down in the classic rabbinic literature. What was before that, in general, I think I mentioned this before. In general, when it comes to the Second Temple, we know every detail of Jewish life in the second half of the Second Temple period because of the Talmud. Because of the discussions of the Talmud start from the Hasmonean period and further. So we really know what's going on from that point, from the 2nd century before the Common Era, maybe even from the 3rd century before the Common Era, maybe. Before that, we can only assume that what is was, but it's really hard to know otherwise. However, we do know from some places in the prophets, there were some differences in the way they understood Jewish law. But again, we only have little hints here and there. One example, for instance, the book of Ruth, which we just mentioned earlier. In the book of Ruth, when Ruth meets Boaz, already in chapter 2, and she comes back and tells her mother-in-law, Naomi, so Naomi says to her, oh, Boaz is our relative and he is a redeemer. What does it mean he is a redeemer? In the Torah, in the Pentateuch, there is the law of what's called a levirate marriage. In Hebrew, it's called yibum, which means if you have 2 brothers who live together, and one of the brothers dies and has no children but has a wife, it is a mitzvah, a good thing, for the brother to marry the widow of his brother and have a child in the name of his deceased brother. In the Torah, that's called yibum. In English, we say a levirate marriage. I don't know if you say that in Romanian, a levirate marriage. Is there a word for yibum? I guess we can look up on Professor Google. Let's do English. We'll do Hebrew. Do Romanian. Let's see if I can do it. So in Romanian, it says levirat. It's the same word as in English. Levirat. Okay, it's one of those hard words. So I only know it because I look for that word. So again, there's a mitzvah for the brother to marry the wife of his brother who died and to have a child in his brother's name. If he does not want to marry his brother's wife, there is a ceremony called chalitza. And in this ceremony, the way it's described in the Torah, it's a public ceremony. He removes his sandal, or somebody removes his sandal, and the woman spits on the ground and says, this is what should be to a person who's not willing to have a child in the name of his brother. Meaning it's considered a bad thing that he was not allowed to do it. That's called yibum. Yibum. Yibum in the Torah is one brother to another brother, not a cousin, not a distant relative, not anything else. But in the book of Ruth, Naomi says to Ruth that Boaz, who was not the brother of her husband Elimelech, but a distant relative, is one of the possible redeemers, meaning somebody you can marry and have a child in the name of your deceased husband. So it seems that in the first temple period, they had a very liberal interpretation of the levirat marriage, and it meant that even a relative, it was considered, I guess for a relative, maybe it was not an obligation, but it was considered a good deed if they would marry this woman and have a child in the name of her husband. So we see from the book of Ruth that they had a more liberal interpretation of the meaning of a brother, where they interpreted it as meaning a relative. And so the closer relative would have the first opportunity to do this mitzvah. And that's exactly what you have in the book of Ruth, chapter 3, where Boaz goes over to somebody who's a closer relative and says to him, would you like to marry Ruth the Moabite? But as soon as he hears that Ruth is a Moabite, he says, no. He says, you do it. And then Boaz marries her. Okay? So that's an example of a law from the Pentateuch, which was interpreted slightly differently in the first temple period. Another example of this, by the way, today in Judaism, the levirat marriage, the yibum, is not allowed. You must do chalitza. This is already from the Middle Ages, from the 12th century. And the reason was because it created problems. I'll give you an example. Let's say the brother was very rich and he died, and now his widow is very rich. So maybe the brother's going to marry the widow for the wrong reasons, and she doesn't like him. So now she's stuck with him until he does the chalitza ceremony. So today the chalitza ceremony is forced upon the brother. And so that's the way it's done. Anyhow.
Sorry, how do you, you said that there is a Romanian term for levirat?
Levirat, yes, that is Romanian according to the dictionary.
Levirat.
Levirat, Levirat.
Okay, I found it. Yeah, I searched for the levirat. Levirat, yes.
Okay. In Hebrew, yibum.
Yes, yibum. Yeah, thank you. I found it.
Yeah, if you want to know where it is in the Pentateuch, 1 second. In the Pentateuch, it is in the book of Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. Deuteronomy chapter, capitolul 25, verse 5.
And now, how is the tradition with the widow?
How is what?
The tradition with the widow, how it's
I just told you that
no,
the rabbinic court forces chalitza. It does not respect the idea of yibum anymore because of problems that yibum can create socially. So basically, the brother must give her the chalitza. It must be done, and then she goes marries whoever she wants to marry.
okay, she's free now.
Yes. Because she is stuck until he does the ceremony. That's why he has to do it immediately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. That's basically it. One other example of a law which we know is different in the First Temple times than the way it's done today, but it's not. But again, the question is why. So we know from the book of Ezekiel, no, it was Ezekiel or Zechariah, I forget already. I think it's in Ezekiel, that the Kohanim, the priests, according to the Pentateuch, according to the Torah, a priest is not allowed to marry a divorcee, but is allowed to marry a widow. I'm talking about a Kohen. Only the high priest is not allowed to marry a widow. But so a priest is not allowed to marry a divorcee, and the high priest cannot marry a divorcee or a widow. But in the book of Ezekiel, he says that the priests did not marry even a widow unless it was the widow of another priest. And this is not the way we understand the law today. Now, it is possible that they were a little bit more strict in Ezekiel, and I'll tell you why. When the priests had a lot of power, especially in the Second Temple period. Of course, Ezekiel is living during the Babylonian exile, but the priests had a lot of power. And because that could be a reason why they didn't want priests to marry widows, widows they could, but divorcees no. I can think of two reasons. Number one, remember the priests were all supposed to be the people of peace, like Aaron. It says about Aaron that he was a man of peace, trying to do coaching, getting people to cooperate. But a divorce means that the priest failed because they didn't get along, right? So he shouldn't be able to reap the benefits of their failures. You could understand it, first of all, that way, because the priests were the ones who people would turn to if there were problems. They wanted them to solve the problem, just like rabbis and priests work today, right? The second thing is, the high priest specifically could not marry a widow. And this you could understand because the high priest also had political power. And somebody in politics were always afraid that they might use their political power for the wrong reasons. Like maybe to get rid of somebody, to have their wife. So you're always afraid of things like that. So once you already say they can't marry a widow, you've already curtailed some of their power. I'm just saying this as a hypothesis. It doesn't say anywhere that this is the reason. I'm trying to hypothesize why this could be a reason. So it could be that in Ezekiel, none of the Kohanim were allowed to marry widows because maybe they were afraid that the Kohanim of those days had too much power. That's the only thing I can think of. But I'm bringing this as an example of a place where there's a slight deviation from the way they understood the law to the way we understood the law of the priests. We don't have a lot of cases like this, but it would be interesting if we did find the way they kept. You see, we don't know enough in the First Temple period. All we know is what's written in Scripture and what's found in archaeology. That's it. Whereas in the Second Temple period, the Talmud has 40 volumes of very detailed discussions of so many things. It makes life easy. And you have the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. So we really, really know a lot. So it's a whole different world in that sense. I just wanted to point that out. In reality, if it wasn't for the Talmudic literature, we wouldn't know a lot about Judaism. We would know maybe how Jews keep the laws today, but we wouldn't know where it came from. We wouldn't know all the theoretical discussions. Really, it's really an amazing phenomenon, and we really owe a lot to those who put together the Talmud, because we would know so little without that. Then on the Talmud, this is part of our discussion. Okay, what happened now during this period in Babylonia? Most of the Jews in the world are living in Babylonia. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the majority of Jews in the world are living in Babylonia, which is maybe a few, maybe 1 million or 2 people, maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million people. That's about it. Probably less, because in the Second Temple period, Josephus claims there were about 2 million Jews in Judea. So there were probably much less than that in Babylonia. But the Jews in Babylonia had quite a quiet life. You had the Sassanide government in the 2nd, 3rd century, with their leaders who were called Shabur Malka. And they were quite, they were very tolerant towards the Jewish communities and allowed them freedom of culture and religion. And so the Babylonian Talmud really had the ability to thrive, and the academies to thrive in Babylonia at the time. You also had the Exilarch, which was really a rabbi who was in charge of the Jewish communities in Babylonia. And he was like the king of the Jews, appointed by the Babylonian king. We call it the Exilarch, or in Hebrew, the Reish Galuta, which is really Aramaic, the head of the exiles. He was usually somebody from the house of David, because that's our royalty. So they preferred to take somebody from the house of David to be the Exilarch in Babylonia. What else happens in Babylonia? I said from 500 to 600, we have the Sevoraim in Babylonia, who, as far as we know, were editors of the Talmud, but we don't know much more about them, aside from some of their names. From 600 to 1000, we're still in Babylonia. We have another period which is called the Geonim. The scholars who lived in Babylonia at the time were given a new name, the Geonim. In modern Hebrew, Gaon means genius, but not in biblical Hebrew. In biblical Hebrew, Gaon means His Excellency, His Highness. Geut in biblical Hebrew means something which is high. So for instance, it says in the Psalms, Psalm 92, God reigns, Hashem malach geut lavesh. God reigns and He clothes Himself with His loftiness. And the term there is geut for loftiness, something which is very high. So in modern Hebrew, by the way, high tide is called geut, and the low tide is called shefel. So even in modern Hebrew, you have that term geut or gaon used in the term of something which is high. So geonim means their excellence, their highness. So it was a term, it was a connotation of a certain status within society. The Geonim were named such because they were the head of the institutions, the rabbinic institutions of Babylonia, the academies of study, possibly the synagogues too. And we know quite a few of the names of the Geonim, but I'll just mention some of the ones who wrote things. One of them, for instance, is Amram Gaon, who lives around the 10th century. And he put together the first prayer book, Amram Gaon. It's called Seder Amram Gaon, which eventually becomes known as the Sidur. Sidur means something which is organized. So Amram Gaon is the first Sidur, the first Jewish prayer book. He dies, it's earlier. He's the 8th century. He dies in 875. So that's 9th century. And another one I mentioned here is Saadia Gaon, who lives in the 9th century. Also, he writes the first book on Jewish philosophy called Opinions and Beliefs, Emunot Vedeot in Hebrew. Shrira Gaon, who lives in the 8th century, wrote a letter on how the oral tradition developed, A lot of the things that we know, aside from the Talmud, we know from Amram Gaon, who lists the names of the Tanaim and the names of the Amoraim and the Sforaim. So he really puts it in an orderly fashion for us to understand that period very well, or else you'd have to go through all of the Talmud just to figure it out. So these are the time of the Geonim. Now the Geonim used to write in Aramaic until the 7th century. In the 7th century, there's the Muslim conquest of Babylonia, and then the vernacular becomes Arabic. So that Saadia Gaon, writing in the 9th century, is already writing in Judeo-Arabic, which means they're speaking Arabic, but they're writing it in Hebrew letters. Just like Yiddish is a Germanic language which is written in Hebrew letters. Or Ladino, which is a Spanish language written in Hebrew letters. And Spaniolit. So that's the way they used to. So they used to speak Arabic, and but they used to write it with Hebrew letters. So his book, The Opinions and Beliefs, was written in Judeo-Arabic, as was Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed in the 12th century, written in Judeo-Arabic, Arabic in Hebrew letters. Okay. Go on a little bit. In the year 1000, wait a sec, already in 1000, so this is in the wrong spot. 1 second, where'd it go? Okay, let me move this. Here. In the year 1000, you have a new era called the Rishonim. It literally means the early rabbis. Rishon in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, means first. In older Hebrew, means the early. Now this is interesting, like the early prophets. How can you? Why are these the early rabbis if you had before them the Geonim, the Amoraim, the Tanaim? How are they the early rabbis? It's like in Israel, we have a bank called Habanka Ben Leumi Rishon, the first international bank. But it wasn't the first bank in Israel which was international. Bank Leumi was international before it. So what's the first international bank? So the same thing with the Rishonim. Why are these the early rabbis? If before them you had hundreds of years of rabbis, even in Babylonia. The answer is because these are the early rabbis outside of Babylonia. By the 10th century, Jews are starting to make their way outside of Babylonia to new frontiers, to new countries. First to Spain. Jews make their way to Spain with the Muslim conquest in the 8th century. There were Jews actually in Spain even before that, but not in large amounts. The building up of the Jewish community in Spain starts with the Muslim conquest, and Jews follow the Muslims from Babylonia to Spain. You also have Jews going to Italy in the 10th century and into France and Germany, which is called Ashkenaz in those days by the Jews. You have Jews coming to England, to North Africa. So the reason why this new era is called Rishonim, it means the rabbis of the new communities outside of Babylonia and Judea, which at this point is called Palestine by the Romans. Although with the Muslim conquest, it actually changes its name. It later becomes part of the Ottoman Empire. It's actually a province within the Ottoman Empire, and it loses the name Palestine. It only gets it back again under the under the British. What am I saying? Under the British. Okay, so Rishonim. So at this point, by the way, this is the point where we're now starting to talk about Ashkenaz and Sephardic Jews. Before that, you didn't have Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews. It's from the 10th century because most Jews lived in Babylonia. If they didn't live, of course, you had Jewish communities in Egypt, but since 115, which was the revolt in Egypt against the Roman Empire, there were not a lot of Jews living there. So as these communities grow, these become the rabbis of the new communities. So which communities are we talking about? I just mentioned the names of the communities, but let's just explain a little bit further. You have simultaneous Jewish communities at that time. You have Spain, and Spain, by the Jew of Spain, of course, is España. But for the Jews started calling Spain Sepharad, which is the name which is used even today in modern Hebrew. Now, why do the Jews call Spain Sepharad? The reason is the book of Obadiah in the Minor Prophets. Obadiah is only one chapter. Right after Amos. Here it is, the book of Obadiah. It's only one chapter, so it's hard to find sometimes. So at the end of Obadiah, in verse 20, there are only 21 verses. He says, "V'galut hachel hazeh," and this exile, this beginning exile, which hosts the children of Israel, who are among the Canaanim as far as Tzorfat. By the way, Tzorfat in modern Hebrew means France, but Tzorfat in the Bible is somewhere in Lebanon. It was not far from Israel. So, but here it says Canaanim. Canaanim, of course, is Canaanites. Ad Tzorfat, which means the ones who went as far as someplace in, as I said, maybe Lebanon, maybe a little bit further up. And then it says, and the exile of Jerusalem, which is in Sepharad. They will occupy the cities of the Negev. And the liberator shall ascend upon Zion to judge the mountain of Esav, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. So the Jews living in Spain said, well, we came from Jerusalem, and it says that the exile from Jerusalem is in Sfarad, so España must be Sfarad. So they decided from that time on, they called España Sfarad. And till this day, the Jews who can trace their origins to Spain, we call them Sephardim. I have a book, it's in my car, about Sephardic synagogues in Romania. Because you had different times, you had Bulgaria had a lot of Sephardic Jews, but Romania also had, possibly more in Constanza at one time because it was on the border. But it was also the Ottomans used to occupy it every now and then. So I'm just saying, why today do you have Jews from Morocco or from Libya and they call themselves Sephardim? Because they can trace their roots to Spain. If you remember with the Spanish expulsion, many Jews just jumped over the border to Morocco and started and went to the communities there. There were existing Jewish communities in Morocco as there were communities in Spain. So you actually had a North African Jewish communities existing simultaneous to the Jews in Spain, but with the expulsion of the Jews in Spain, which were a massive group, they became the majority of the Jewish communities in North Africa. Sometimes you can tell by the family names. Obviously, if the family name is Toledano, they're from Toledo. Castellano, Castilla, right? Or Castel sometimes. Cordovero, Cordova, right? That's obvious. But sometimes it's not as obvious. And there are people who are experts in knowing which family names come from what the Berber tribes, meaning the Jews who lived among the Berber tribes, and which ones came from originally from Spain. But as I said, Jews who went all over North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, Egypt. And these are today known as Sephardim because the vast majority of them can trace their roots to Sfarad, to Spain, possibly even 80%. Who are the Ashkenazim, which today in Israel is about half the Jews, and worldwide is probably the majority of Jews today? The Ashkenazim are the Jews who came in the 10th century to the areas around the Rhine River, which is France and Germany of today. This area of Franco-Germany was termed Ashkenaz. The reason why it was termed Ashkenaz is based on an Aramaic translation in the book of Genesis. Because among the children of Noah, at the end of let's see if I can find it quickly, when it says these are the children of Noah. Yes, chapter 10 in Genesis. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. And the sons of Yefet, the second son of Noah, were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavan, Tuval, Meshech, and Tiras. And the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Rifat. There is an Aramaic translation which translates Ashkenaz, meaning it's called the Jerusalem translation, which instead of Ashkenaz says Germany. He had some tradition that this Ashkenaz founded Germany. So Jews who lived in that area around the Rhine River started calling themselves Ashkenazim. And the German language became known as Ashkenazit. And the Jews who lived in that area started developing their own Hebrew dialect of that language, which was known as Yiddish. So Yiddish is from the 10th century approximately. So if today you have an Ashkenazic Jew who traces their roots to Poland or Romania or Republic of Moldova or the Ukraine, but it means originally their ancestors lived at some point in Franco-Germany. Now, the very interesting thing is that approximately during the time of the Crusades, where unfortunately you had major slaughterings of Ashkenazic Jews, especially in Germany in the cities of Spires, Worms, and Mainz, Magens. So there were actually not a lot of Jews in the world. We call that the bottleneck of Ashkenazic Jewry. There were probably not more than 100,000 Ashkenazic Jews in the world at the time. That means that today, if according to the demographers, there are approximately 14 to 15 million Jews that we know of today in the world, and if Ashkenazic Jews are the majority of that 15 million, meaning possibly 8 to 9 of those people, maybe even 10, but at least 8 to 9, that means that you have 8 to 9 million Jews who are descended from 100,000 people in the 13th century, 12th to 13th century. That's the reason, by the way, why they're among Ashkenazic Jews, you have a lot of particular, what do you call it, genetic diseases that have to be tested. Because when so many people come from so few people, so like, for instance, one of the ones that when I was a kid, they always said you have to be tested for Tay-Sachs among Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe. It's actually prominent among Ashkenazic Jews and among Black Americans, Tay-Sachs, for some reason. But Sephardic Jews know nothing about it. They lived in different countries and came from different parents. So, at least during those points of history. It's just interesting that the Ashkenazic Jewry came from they call it a bottleneck. It was under 100,000 people at some point. It's not clear exactly how many it was. Might have been even been a lot under 100,000. So I'm not an expert on that part, but I just know about it. So it's interesting how these things turn themselves around. So when we talk about Ashkenazim and Sephardim, there are two communities, but these are communities that trace their roots back to Franco-Germany and Spain. But there are other groups from the Middle Ages. Italian Jews trace their roots back to Italy, meaning at the same time, meaning you had Italian Jewish communities at the same time you had from the 10th to 15th century, just like you had in Spain and you had in Franco-Germany. There weren't a lot, but eventually, and a lot of them, didn't make it after the Shoah, but I'm just saying there are Italian Jews. Today in Italy, most of the Jews who live in Italy today came from Libya. Because, Italy conquered Libya and conquered Yemen and Ethiopia, so all these people got Italian passports. You also have Jewish communities that lived also alongside who are not Ashkenazic, Sephardic, or Italian. Iraqi Jews have been there since the Second Temple, possibly earlier, some of them, but most of them from the Second Temple, from the, as I said, the Jews who went to Babylonia. You had Jews in Iraq until the founding of the State of Israel. There are even a few left over today, but not a lot. So the Iraqi Jewish community is neither Sephardi nor Ashkenazi. Persian Jews, they're not Sephardi or Ashkenazi. They also, from the Second Temple period, they actually could trace their roots back in maybe a little earlier than that. Yemenite Jews trace their roots back to the First Temple period, not to the sea, not even to the second. So I'm just saying you have other groups aside from Sephardim and Ashkenazim, even though those are the largest groups and they get the most, they're most talked about. So, okay. Questions until now? Okay, I think we've done it.
Sorry, I have a question. Maybe for the next time when we see, if you can explain the political structure, organization of the society, because Synedriu, we've heard a lot about Synedriu, even, in...
Sanhedrin are you referring to?
Synedriu.
What's Synedriu?
Yeah. Is the political organization of the rabbi or
Sanhedrin?
Synedriu in the church, in the Orthodox Church.
And maybe you can present a little bit.
Synedriu? Wait, what's Synedriu? I don't know what Synedriu means.
Synedrin. We call it Synedriu.
Oh, Sanhedrin. You mean where the 71 rabbis who, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and maybe, just to have a context, to present the structure of the...
Okay.
For the next time.
Basically the Sanhedrin, of course, it's a Greek word. It was established, in its latest institution, it was established probably somewhere in the Hasmonean period of the 2nd century before the Common Era. And it was the High Court in Jerusalem. There were other courts too. There were courts of 23, which were in every province, but the High Court in Jerusalem, which was on the Temple Mount, had 71 sages. And if there was a problem in the law, people came there. They also were responsible for the new moon, which was done by witnesses, and calculating before there was an established calendar.
So it was a kind of court of justice.
That's correct. And
it appears also in your notes of today.
Yeah. So the 71, everyone had to have received the original ordination since Moses to be a member of the Sanhedrin. That's why they were called Rabbi. In English, we write R-A-B-B-I, rabbi. But the Romans were afraid that the Sanhedrin, remember, after Jerusalem was destroyed, so there was no more king. And of course, there was no more high priest, even though in the second temple, the high priest became the kings, which was not allowed according to Jewish law, but that's what happened. So the only power that was left among the Jewish community was the Sanhedrin, the high court. The Romans kept that for a while, but after the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135, which was supported by the Sanhedrin, meaning they supported the idea, so then the Romans decided enough is enough, we're getting rid of the Sanhedrin. And because first they pushed the Sanhedrin north all the time to keep it away from the Temple Mount, because they knew that would curtail its power, because it wasn't allowed to decide. The Sanhedrin, which is, by the way, moved out of Jerusalem already at the beginning of the 1st century, before the destruction of the temple, was not allowed to decide areas of capital punishment once it was not on the Temple Mount. It was only allowed to decide areas of what we call the laws of penalties. Knasot. So that's why the Romans moved them out, basically. They wanted to curtail their power. And eventually, the Romans also decided that there should be no more rabbinic ordination. That was stopped in the 4th century. So that all the rabbis today, because there was a break in the line of the original ordination, are called Rav instead of Rabbi. Rabbi was the ones with the original ordination, and it was done in the land of Israel. And if not, you were called Rav, which means you're sort of an emissary of the rabbis of old. So that the original rabbinic ordination stops somewhere at the end of the 3rd century, maybe the beginning of the 4th century. And all the rabbis in Babylonia are called Rav, are not called Rabbi anymore. Okay, we'll talk about this if you want more next time. I think that's enough for now. It's a lot of information. So I wish everybody Bunasera, Erev Tov, and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.